Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special doctoral graduation ceremony of Stellenbosch University. I'm certain that I'm speaking on behalf of all the doctoral candidates in directing a very warm welcome to our guests who are present here this afternoon, spouses, parents, children, family and friends. Ladies and gentlemen, our doctoral candidates getting kept today exemplify a specific aspect of Stellenbosch University's vision, namely thought leadership, and specifically the diversity of thought leadership. Your studies have given you deep insight in your particular field, which means you are now equipped to lead the thinking in that field, be it arts and social sciences, or education, or law, or theology, or medicine and health sciences. But your studies have also equipped you to lead the thinking of your generation. And here I'm referring to your ability to solve problems, to serve society, and to use your knowledge to the best of this great continent. There's also another aspect of thought leadership that is important, and that is to pass the baton to the next generation. Your studies have prepared you to now lead others down the path of discovery in the routes that you have gone. And I have no doubt that you will also do us proud in this regard. So congratulations for now, and I will repeat it later. Ik sal nou aan die kandidaten wat aan my voorgestel word, die onderskeie doktersgrade verleen. I'll now confer on the candidates who are presented to me the respective doctoral degrees.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wijsbegeerte aan die kandidaten wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I will present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Philip Honorariode Ogovovia, the supervisor, Dr. Louise Green, Department of English.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Philip Ogovovia's dissertation is rich with insights about how poets and filmmakers in the Niger Delta have responded to half a century of oil extraction in the region. Ogogovia points out the limitations of contemporary theories of eco-criticism and develops an alternative approach, which he calls petro-environmentalism, that makes an important critical intervention. I request you to confer the degree on Philip Ogogovia.
Susanna Ronel Allen, met promotor Dr. Anton Ehlers, Departement Geskiedenis.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, die geskiedenis van BP Lang beperk vir die hoërige studie van 'n Oeverbergse plaaslike en streeks familiebesigheid. Die studie poog om BP Lang se ontwikkeling te verklaar aan die hand van 'n 7-stadia lewensiklusmodel en weerspieël die tradisionele uitdagings wat sodanige besighede ervaar. Hierdie studie lewer 'n belangrike bydrae tot die Suid-Afrikaanse historiografie oor familiebesighede en sakegeskiedenis in die algemeen. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Susanna Ronel Allen te verleen.
Jenna Elizabeth Barlow, Professor Grace Musila of the Department of English will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Gina Barlow's dissertation assesses the impact of the popularization of feminist discourse on the genre of women's historical fiction during the 20th and 21st centuries and provides an explanation for the revived interest in the Tudor period in contemporary global popular culture. I request you to confer the degree on Gina Barlow.
Arlene Benjamin, with Supervisor Professor Ronel Carolison, Psychology.
Mr. Vice Rector, this important social constructionist qualitative study focuses on trauma and resilience in the narratives of women counsellors living and working in a low-income Cape Flats community marked by ongoing violence. Negative resilience, as well as positive resilience, which promotes healing, are evident in counsellors' stories which are able to inform context-driven psychosocial mental health interventions. I request you to confer the degree on Arlene Benjamin.
Michael James Coombs, with Supervisor Dr. Anna-Marie Kotze, Ancient Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, using an innovative approach, the candidate employed contemporary theories of discourse to challenge arguments in recent scholarship that Augustine did not win the public debate against his Manichaean religious opponent, Fortunatus. The study also made possible valuable perspectives on the role of Manichaeism in the development of Augustine's thought. I request you to confer the degree on Michael Coombs.
Courtney Laurie Davids, with Supervisor Dr. David de Villiers, Department of English.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study focuses on the writing of the unknown yet prolific 19th century author Catherine Hubback, the niece of Jane Austen. Ms. Davids demonstrates how Hubback's work simultaneously challenges and endorses 19th century ideals of domesticity, thereby contributing to an understanding of the period, particularly in its complex interrelation of ideology, domestic practice, and literature. I request you to confer the degree on Courtney Laurie Davids.
Carla Justine Dukas, with Supervisor Professor Louis-Marie Creer, Psychology.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in this feminist qualitative study, low-income rural women provided rich descriptions of their subjectively lived experience of depression. Analysis of the data highlighted that a diagnosis of depression may serve to obscure women's feelings of anger and anxiety about having to live, work, and care for others in severely compromised socioeconomic conditions. As such, individual women's emotional reactions are pathologized rather than society itself. I request you to confer the degree on Carla Duka.
Danson Sylvester Kanya, the Supervisor Professor Tina Steiner, Department English.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, This insightful and elegantly written thesis examines how selected Ugandan literary texts portray constructions and negotiations of national identities as they intersect with overlapping and cross-cutting identities like race, ethnicity, and gender. Among other findings, the study reveals that exclusive identity politics are often detrimental to imagining an inclusive, multi-ethnic, and multicultural Ugandan nation. I request you to confer the degree on Danson Sylvester Kayana.
Ndivuvo Mord-Ruli with Supervisor Professor Johan Mouton of the Center for Research on Science and Technology, CREST.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the study by Ndivuvo Mord-Ruli undertook a groundbreaking review of the history of research funding in South Africa and specifically its roots in the Research Grants Board of 1918. But the main focus of the study was on the relationship between sources of research funding and modes of research. And the major results of the study point to the fact that this is a much more complicated relationship that exists between sources of funding and modes of research than is found in much of the current scholarship. I request that you award a degree to Ndivuvo Mord-Ruli.
Kudakwashe Manganga with Supervisor Professor Bill Nasson, History.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Kudakwashe Manganga's dissertation charts the construction of worker identities in colonial Zimbabwe from the 1890s to the 1980s. It examines the complex ways in which diverse African groups and individuals created and used their own forms of ethnic identification. These definitions were exploited for competitive advantage in the search for industrial jobs, which had become associated with particular types of workers. I request you to confirm the degree on Kudakwashe Manganga.
Frankie Lucas Monama with Supervisor Professor Bill Nasson.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Funky Monama's dissertation is the first comprehensive exploration of pro-war propaganda in South Africa during the Second World War. Leading a country split over participation in hostilities, the Smuts government mounted a massive campaign to convert inhabitants to support of its war policy. As the study reveals, these publicity energies fell well short of forging a national war unity. I request you to confirm the degree on Funky Lucas Monama.
Evan Matunga with Supervisor Professor Ronnie Donaldson of Geography and Environmental Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the central question in this study is why is urban planning in Malawi, as it is conceived and acted upon, a creator and not a mediator of urban land conflicts? The study aimed to answer this question by using Lefebvre's conceptual triad of social production of space. I request you to confer the degree on Evan Muatungu.
Wesley Mwatwara, the supervisor, Professor Sandra Swart of History.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this thesis explores the relationship between African traditional livestock regimes and state veterinary services in colonial Zimbabwe Rhodesia from the perspective of socio-environmental history. It examines the complex, fluid, and interactive interdependence of people, animals, and disease, and discusses how the veterinary medicine, conservation policies, and introduced epizootics impacted on African traditional livestock regimes historically. I request you to confer the degree on Wesley Mwatwara.
Magdalena Johanna Oosthuizen met promotor Professor Winfried Liedeman van Musiek.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, Arnold van Wyk geld as die eerste Suid-Afrikaanse kunsmusiekkomponis. Die liedkuns beklee 'n sentrale plek in sy werk en besorg hom internasionale erkenning. Met inagneem van talle ongepubliseerde liedere en komposisiesketse het me Oosthuizen vir die eerste keer die volle omvang van die komponis se liedskepping ondersoek. 'n Geheelbeeld van Wyk as liedkomponis word uiteindelik moontlik. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Magdalena Johanna Oosthuizen te verleen.
Linda Spencer, Professor Tina Steiner will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this innovative study explores literary narratives by emerging women writers from the post-repressive states of Uganda and South Africa. It presents original insights into the ways in which they critique nationalist narratives and articulate a gendered nationalism through their renegotiation of female identities and experimental use of popular genres. I request you to confer the degree on Linda Gikanda Spencer.
Johanna Stein met promotor Professor Ilse Feinhauer van Afrikaans en Nederlands.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, Johanna Stein ondersoek die oordrag van kulturele verwysings in die Franse vertalings van Afrikaanse romans van Etienne van Heerden. Die sweye van Mario Salviati is direk uit Afrikaans en Frans vertaal, terwyl Toorberg 'n ABBA-vertaling is. Dit is dus uit die Engels in Frans vertaal. Sy bevind dat die Franse Le Domaine de Toorberg kultureel heel wat verder verwyder is van die Afrikaanse bronteks as wat die geval is by die Franse vertaling van Mario Salviati. Ek versoek u hiermee dus graag om die graad PhD in vertaling aan Johanna Stein te verleen.
Fumene George Tsibani, the supervisor, Professor Corne Groenewald of the Department Sociology and Social Anthropology.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this is a socio-political study of water. Against all odds, George Tsibani successfully completed the study that culminated in a feasible framework for the training of municipal councillors in water services to become effective agents in combating poverty in our increasingly water-scarce country. The frequent public protests against incompetent service delivery in South Africa were testimony to the urgent need for this research. I therefore request you to confer the degree of Doctor of Philosophy on Phumeni George Tsibani.
Justice Twesigeye with Professor Ashraf Kaji from the Department of Psychology.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this qualitative study conducted in Uganda found diverse explanatory models among patients and care providers regarding the experience and treatment of mood disorders. Participants reported various structural barriers to the effective provision of treatment. The results have important implications for mental health policy development in Uganda and other resource-constrained contexts. I request that you confer the degree on Justice Twesigeye.
Annemarie van Zyl met promotor Professor Matilda Burden.
Meneer die Fisiekanselier, 'n dualisme in die aanwending van die begrip Victoriaans by Suid-Afrikaanse argitektuur wat lei tot 'n mate van onbegrip by bewaringsliggame en erfeniskonsultante is in hierdie studie blootgelê. Deur analisering van die abstrakte determinante soos die sosio-kulturele dryfvere onderliggend aan die verskillende manifestasies van die boustyl, is 'n breë akademiese en teoretiese raamwerk geskep wat bydra tot die meer sinvolle bewaring van sodanige geboue. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Annemarie van Zyl toe te ken.
John Wakota, the Supervisor, Professor Grace Musila, Department of English.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, John Wakota examined representations of gender relations in Tanzanian English and Swahili novels set in historical periods marked by economic change. And these are the pre-colonial, colonial, nationalism, ujamaa, and the current neoliberal context. He identified contradictory shifts in gender relations across Tanzania's history, owing to complex interactions between gender, economic change, and multiple patriarchies. I request you to confer the degree on John Wakota.
Lauren Patricia Wilskut, with Supervisor Professor Johan Meton of Crest.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in this study, the candidate reviewed the origins and wide range of types of logic models and logical frameworks, and also included an in-depth reconstruction of the history of theory-based evaluations. These analyses resulted in an innovative typology of logic models, which clearly showed that these frameworks have developed into a wide range of tools for monitoring and evaluation. In the final part of the study, the candidate conducted the first empirical survey in South Africa amongst NGOs and documented their experiences towards these frameworks. I request that you confer the first degree in PhD evaluation studies in this country on Lauren Patricia Wilskut.
Konrad Stanislav Zygmunt, with Supervisor Professor Tony Naidu, Department of Psychology.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study investigated ways in which a school-based wilderness adventure program was experienced and the specific aspects responsible for variation in program outcomes. Using a phenomenographic approach, the candidate identified 4 major conceptions of the program and 6 major dimensions of variations that explain the hierarchical relationships among these categories. This study provides an illustration of how phenomenography can be used in researching psychological interventions. Mr. Chancellor, I request that you confer the degree on Conrad Stanislaw Sigmund.
Faculty of Education, meneer die vice-kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Abdullah Bayat, with Supervisor Professor Aslam Fattar, Education Policy Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this thesis by articles focuses on the professional identities and practices of school administrative clerks at 3 schools in the Western Cape. The thesis suggests that these secretaries' so-called subordinated status plays a significant role in how they constitute their identities and practices and make their professional contributions. The study's key contribution resides in an understanding of their daily creative border crossings between their school management practices and their broader educational contributions at their schools. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Abdullah Bayat.
Lynn Nesta Damons, with Supervisor Professor Doria Daniels from Education Psychology.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this participatory action research explored the developmental capabilities of an invention program for socially marginalized boys who have membership to an outcast group, focusing on the strengths of their dysfunctional behavior and validating their personal agency. The researcher succeeds in changing the culture of defiance and interrupts the trajectory to delinquency. I request you to confer the degree on Lynn Nesta Damons.
Edwin Darrell de Klerk, with Supervisor Professor Bertie van Wyk, Education Policy Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in this dissertation, 3 regularities, governmentality, managerialism, and performativity were utilized to analyze policies, and 6 innovative perspectives regarding teacher autonomy and professionalism were suggested. From a Foucauldian frame of reference, it is argued that the articulation of these original perspectives is an experiment that provides teachers with possibilities to go beyond mere compliance and docility. I request you to confer the degree on Edwin Darrell de Klerk.
Rachel Ndinelao Shanyanana, Professor Yusuf Wahid, Education Policy Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the candidate identifies a problem in higher education discourses on the African continent. Women are not substantively presented, although they are statistically represented. She uses a reconsidered ethics of care framework and argues that male chauvinism, patriarchy, authoritarianism ought to be disrupted. I request that you confer the degree on Rachel Ndinelao Shanyanana.
Nolita Yvonne Vukuza-Linde, with Supervisor Professor Bertie van Wyk, Education Policy Studies.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the reshaping of institutional culture is evident in this inquiry, and the immersed institution is battling to find a balance between the traditions of a university and a technikon. The us disposition in the 2020 vision was found to imply a narrowing effect from an international affiliation in 2006 to an exclusive African focus in 2020. I request you to confer the degree on Nolita Yvonne Vukuza-Linde.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on Barry Simon Andrews the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Sports Science. The Supervisor, Professor L. Bresson, will give a brief outline of the dissertation.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, South Africa is famous for the winning record of its Paralympic team. This research tracked biomechanical changes in the running performance of 4 champion disabled sprinters as they trained for the London Paralympics. Analysis of these changes will provide critical information on which to base a scientific approach to coaching the technical aspects of disability sport in the future. I request you to confer the degree on Barry Simon Andrews.
Meneer die Visiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die regsgeleerdheid aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Laws. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Johan Boysen met promotor Professor Cornie van der Merwe.
Meneer die Visiekanselier, Johan Boysen het geskryf oor die wet op deeltitels. Hy waarsku dat indien die finansiële en sosiale verpligtinge van deeleienaars nie behoorlik afgedwing word nie, die harmonie in 'n deeltitelskema sal verdwyn en die skema weens die gebrek aan fondse vir herstelwerk in 'n krotbuurt sal verander. Deur middel van regsvergelykende studie toon Boysen aan hoe die ondoeltreffende sanksies van die Suid-Afrikaanse reg verbeter kan word. Hy dui byvoorbeeld aan dat dit nie teen die Suid-Afrikaanse grondwet sal wees om 'n sanksie in die skema-reëls in te voeg wat 'n ernstige moeilikheidmaker is, een wat ongekleed rondloop in die skema en almal beledig wat hy sien nie. Dat so 'n skande, die moeilikheidmakers sal verbied word om vir 'n maksimum van 3 jaar in sy woonstel te woon. Ek versoek u om die graad LLD aan Johan Boysen toe te gee.
Luyandu Marta Katyatia, and I will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor. The dissertation examines the link between status and addresses the following central question. How can the policy of affirmative action in South Africa be redesigned to ensure that it benefits the socio-economically disadvantaged? The candidate suggests that a paradigm shift is necessary in order to reconceive of affirmative action as a policy that does not only focus on ensuring equitable representation of disadvantaged groups, but also provides for the development of human capacity. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree Doctor of Laws on Ms. Katyatia. Tapia Shumba with Supervisor Professor Joanna Kutsia.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, diversity of laws is a barrier to cross-border trade and thus also to economic growth in SADC. The candidate investigated the viability of a regional sales law by drawing from selected models of harmonized law applied elsewhere. On grounds of that, he made constructive recommendations on legal and institutional reform in SADC. I request you to confer the degree on Tapiwa Shumba.
Meneer die Visie-Kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confirm the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will each time give a brief outline of the dissertation. Jacques Walter Bekes met promotor Professor Naas Swart.
Meneer die Visie-Kanselier, op grond van 'n eie tydse verrekening van die Verenigde Gereformeerde Kerk in Suider-Afrika se belydenis van Belhar, argumenteer Jacques Bekes dat spesifiek die 4de artikel van die belydenis geensins relevantie verloor het in post-apartheid Suid-Afrika nie, en as nodige grondslag dien om 'n teologie van ontwikkeling in die VGKSA te vestig. Bekes toon voorts aan hoe dat sodanige teologie van ontwikkeling die VGKSA behoort te lei tot verskillende modusse van meer diepgaande praktiese betrokkenheid by die Suid-Afrikaanse armoedeprobleem. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Jacques Bekes te verleen.
Sean Victor Barrows met promotor professor Johan Silje.
Meneer die fisiekanselier, in hierdie proefskrif word aangevoer dat prediking 'n wesenlike bydrae kan lewer tot gemeenskapsontwikkeling binne die konteks van post-apartheid Suid-Afrika, onder andere as 'n oproep tot sosiale verantwoordelikheid en veranderde gedragspatrone. Na aanleiding van empiriese navorsing in die Verenigde Gereformeerde Kerk in Suider-Afrika word egter bevind dat juis hierdie potensiaal van prediking nie genoegsaam benut word nie. Die proefskrif lewer 'n innoverende bydrae tot die ontwerp van 'n homiletiese raamwerk vir sosiale transformasie in die Suid-Afrikaanse konteks. Meneer die fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan Sean Victor Barrows te verleen.
Ivan Ekong with supervisor Professor Johan Silje.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, after decades of political marginalization, economic neglect and social exclusion, justice, peace and security remain the greatest needs in the Ibibio society in Nigeria. However, contemporary approaches to conflict resolution, reconciliation and peace, which are more Western inclined and alien to the Ibibio context, have failed to yield meaningful results and in some cases even contributed to escalation of violent conflicts. Using a pragmatic mixed research design within a practical theological framework, the study takes its cues from certain indigenous knowledge systems and innovative suggestions are put forward for the development of preaching within the Nigerian context. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Ivan Ekong.
Benjamin Daniel Giffone with supervisor Professor Louis Jonker.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the Old Testament book of Chronicles is a form of consensus-building literature. The chronicler's portrayal of the tribe of Benjamin in relation to the tribe Judah reflects an inclusive vision of all Israel that simultaneously values Benjamin as an equal partner with Judah, yet still protecting the primacy of David, the Levites, and Jerusalem. This study demonstrated the divergent portrayals of Benjamin in the Deuteronomistic history and Chronicles and situated that phenomenon within the historical context of Persian period Yehud. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request that you confer the doctoral degree in Old Testament on Mr. Benjamin Daniel Giffone.
Martin Kausep with supervisor Professor Christo Tesnaar.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study offers an in-depth engagement with the faith healing practices in the Namibian context. It particularly investigates the spiritual and emotional impact of faith healing on healing seekers where the desired healing did not materialize. The candidate illustrates the hermeneutical value of a holistic approach to care and argues for a culturally relevant pastoral care approach of hope and compassion. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Martin Kausep.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Karen Pamela de Villiers with Supervisor Professor Valerie Caulfield.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, inherited long QT syndrome is a disease that shows marked variation in cardiac symptoms and severity, even in related individuals, suggesting that other genes modify disease presentation. The study identified novel modifier genes and assessed their effect in an affected South African family. Findings will facilitate clinical risk management of this potentially lethal condition. I request that you confer the degree on Ms. Karen de Villiers.
Anzan Dippenaar met promotor Professor Nico G. van Puttius.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, die bakterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis veroorsaak tuberkulose, 'n siekte wat miljoene mense wêreldwyd affekteer. Die spesies bestaan uit verskillende stamme wat verskillende patogeniese eienskappe en gasheeraanpassings vertoon. Die kandidaat het die evolusie en biologiese eienskappe van die lede van die Latyns-Amerikaanse Mediterrane stam van Mycobacterium tuberculosis ondersoek. 'n Stam wat die oorsaak is van die grootste persentasie van TB-gevalle in hoë voorkomstreke van Suid-Afrika. Hierdie studie het 'n beduidende bydrae gemaak tot ons kennis van die evolusie van suksesvolle stamme van M-tuberculosis. Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, ek versoek u dus om die graad aan Anzaan Dippenaar te verleen.
Amanda Genis met promotor Professor Hans Stradon.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, Ms. Genis investigated the mechanisms and responses in the cells that line the blood vessels of the heart, elicited by hypoxia and inflammation, leading to a comprehensive characterization of these under-researched cells. Incorporating state-of-the-art technology, including flow cytometry and proteomics, the study generated novel data on the responses of cardiac endothelial cells to mediators of heart disease. I request you to confer the degree on Amanda Genis.
Paula Louise Headley with Supervisor Professor Valerie Caulfield.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Ms. Headley studied the inherited form of long QT syndrome. She identified known and novel disease-causing mutations in patients, which facilitates understanding of this potentially fatal cardiac condition. Her findings are used in DNA-based diagnostic tests, thereby supporting clinical diagnosis, prognosis, management, and counselling of patients and their families. I request that you confer the degree on Paula Headley.
Louis Jenkins, met promotor Professor Bob Mash.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this thesis evaluated the process of constructing, validating, practically implementing and testing the reliability of a portfolio of learning within the discipline of family medicine and in the context of a need to establish a culture of competency and work-based learning for postgraduate students within the district health services. I request you to confer the degree on Dr. Louis Jenkins.
Nikki Leroux, Dr. Moller will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Nikki Leroux used next-generation sequencing on African buffalo samples to identify novel variants in the genome. Genetic associations with bovine tuberculosis infection status were investigated, and 3 variants were associated with susceptibility. Buffalo act as a maintenance host for Mycobacterium bovis and transmit it to other species. I request you to confer the degree on Nikki Leroux.
Florence Katira Mkaibi with Supervisor Professor Steyn.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study, which was undertaken in rural areas of Kenya, examined the effects of biodiversity, household food insecurity, and dietary diversity on the nutritional status of preschool children with and without stunted growth. The study involved collecting data during the dry season, also during the rainy season from the mothers of children. Findings revealed that dietary diversity can be used as a marker for undernutrition. I request that the degree be confirmed on Florence Mkaibi.
Lubabalo Masingwana with Supervisor Professor Ian Viet.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the candidate showed that sulfamethoxazole, a less toxic sulfonamide and already formulated into a registered antibacterial drug called Bactrim, effectively kills MTB and also acts synergistically with rifampicin against M. tuberculosis, thereby potentially reducing the toxic effects of rifampicin treatment. This finding has potential to aid health workers in the fight against tuberculosis. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I hereby request that you confer the degree on Lubabalo Masingwana.
Stefanie Milan Miller met promotor Dr. Sean Hemmings.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is a debilitating psychiatric disorder with as yet undefined molecular etiology. Using a validated rat model of PTSD in conjunction with next-generation genomic sequencing and epigenetic methodology, this study identified novel molecular pathways underpinning the development of PTSD and associated fear-related phenotypes. I hereby request you to confer the degree on Stefanie Milan Miller.
Jacoba Martina Mouton met promotor Dr. Craig Kinnear.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, myosin-binding protein H is a protein of unknown function. By identifying its protein interacting partners, the study showed that MyPPH is involved in heart muscle contractility and the removal of degraded cellular components. The study further showed that variants in the MyPPH gene modulates heart wall thickness in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Jacoba Martina Mouton.
Mary Letitia Nkata Mugambi, with Supervisor Professor Renee Blau.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Mary Mugambi performed an in-depth evaluation of research on full-term and preterm infants fed infant formula containing live bacterial organisms, and she found that it does not lead to any improved growth or clinical outcomes. She also concluded that the source of funding was not associated with outcomes or author's conclusion in favor of sponsors' products. I hereby request you to confer the degree on Mary Mugambi.
Frederick Nduhira Bundy, with Supervisor Professor Amanda Lochner.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, obesity is associated with heart disease, which is the leading cause of death worldwide. Using an animal model of obesity, the candidate demonstrated that the pineal gland hormone, melatonin, protects the heart against ischemic damage and reverses the harmful effects of obesity by activation of certain intracellular signal transduction processes and metabolic changes. I therefore request you to confirm the degree on Frederick Nduhira Bundy.
Akinsola Abel Ajagbemi, Professor Sidat, will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the Supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study in Nigerian patients with schizophrenia identified early measurable indices of abnormal integration of brain functions as potentially useful markers of vulnerability to schizophrenia. This finding could aid the design of a shorter tool for the identification of early signs of this devastating disease, an important step for possible early intervention. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Akinsola Ajagbemi.
Alita Pithi, with Supervisor Professor Suraya Sidat.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study in rural wine-growing communities found that women with alcohol problems had more post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, than women without drinking problems. Women with drinking problems and PTSD were also more affected by partner violence and stressful life events. Further, drinking women with a fetal alcohol syndrome child had higher rates of depression, PTSD, and partner violence compared to women without an affected child. These findings highlight the importance of early identification and timely targeted intervention for trauma, PTSD, and depression in women with alcohol use disorders. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Alitha Pithi.
Munib Sali, Dr. Moller will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Munib Sali investigated the role of genes in the major histocompatibility and leukocyte receptor complexes in susceptibility to tuberculosis in the South African population. Genes of these complexes are important in disease susceptibility, vaccinology, co-evolution between humans and Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and understanding the ancestral genetic contributions to the South African coloured population. I request you to confer the degree on Munib Sali.
Derek van Vieren met promotor Professor Amanda Lochner.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, die doel van hierdie studie was om die rol van die proteïnfosfatase PP2A in myokardiale ischemie, hyperfusie, oftewel 'n hartaanval, te ondersoek. Die resultate het getoon dat PP2A proteïnvlakke toeneem met ischemie, maar dat hyperfusie die aktiwiteit daarvan inhibeer. Farmakologiese aktivering van hierdie fosfatase tydens ischemie en hyperfusie lei tot die fosforilasie van sekere belangrike kinases en seldood. Ek versoek u om die graad aan meneer Derek van Vieren te verleen.
Michelle Desiree Zaya, Professor Paul Brink will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Dr. Zaya and colleagues provided strong evidence from a large HIV South African cohort that antiretroviral therapy improves the outcome of cervical disease in HIV-infected women. By decreasing cervical human papilloma virus infection, it reduces a progression of low-grade squamous intraepithelial lesions and also recurrence after excision treatment. Meneer die kanselier, vice-kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan die kandidaat toe te ken.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in natuurwetenskappe aan Andreas Retief Coetzee te verleen. Die promotor, Professor Jeff Coetzee, sal 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen.
Meneer die Vice-Kanselier, Andre Coetzee het 45 studies in toonaangewende mediese joernale in verband met hartfunksie tydens narkose en chirurgie gepubliseer. Sy prestasies sluit in demonstrasies dat narkosemiddels kwesbare harte beskerm, as ook ontwikkeling van tegnieke om die hartspier gesond te hou tydens hartchirurgie. Hy het sy bevindinge na kliniese praktyk oorgedra met gevolglike verbeterde pasiëntsorg. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Andreas Coetzee te verleen.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, ons beleef vandag 'n besondere situasie. In die sin dat die persoon aan wie u so pas die gevorderde doktersgraad verleen het, se dogter vandag haar eerste doktersgraad verwerf. Sy verwerf die doktersgraad in die fakulteit Agri-wetenskappe, maar aangesien die gradeplegtigheid toegeken is, aangesien die doktersgrade in die fakulteit Agri-wetenskappe reeds by 'n vorige graadplegtigheid toegeken is toestemming aan my verleen om namens die dekaan van die fakulteit Agri-wetenskappe haar aan u voor te stel, sodat pa en dogter by dieselfde plegtigheid kan gradueer. Ek versoek u dus om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte landbou aan Karin Coetzee te verleen. Die promotor, professor De Tooy, sal 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen.
Die appel val duidelik nie ver van die boom nie. Mr. Vice Chancellor, various techniques were used to assess the evolution of the chemical and sensory profile of a Sauvignon Blanc wine when exposed to controlled repetitive oxidation. The impacts of sensory interactions between oxidation-derived aroma compounds with Sauvignon Blanc aroma compounds was also investigated. This comprehensive study delivered novel results concerning white wine oxidation. I request you to confer the degree on Karin Coetzee.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, ek versoek u om aan die dokterskandidate wie se naam ook aan u voorgelê is, maar wat nie hier teenwoordig is nie, die doktersgrade in afwesigheid te verleen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the doctoral degrees on those candidates whose names have been presented to you but who could not attend in their absence.
I confer the doctoral degrees on the candidates in their absence. Dames en heren, ons het nou die toekenning van die doktersgrade afgehandel en ek wil namens die Universiteit Stellenbosch vir almal van u wat vandag hierdie kwalifikasie verwerf het, hartlik gelukwensen uitsluitende vader en dokter met uitsonderlike prestaties. I also wish to thank all the parents, husbands, wives and family members for their support throughout the years. To all our graduates, please stay in touch. We are working very hard to invite our graduates to all kinds of discussions with our alumni in our alumni functions in all the different countries of this continent. So please feel free to attend some of them. We keep you informed about the great work that we're doing as a university, and we keep you informed about the great work that the professors that we have been working with continues to do as they build this university's stature and as they build this university's position, not only on the continent, but in the world. I'd like to invite you to join us at the Alumni Relations people outside for a glass of bubbly to celebrate. So I say thank you again to everybody who've been part of this day's proceedings with the PhDs, and thank you again to all the supervisors and promoters who supported our students and the deans who created the right atmosphere and conditions for that. We've now come to the end of the proceedings, and I hereby declare this meeting of the congregation of Stellenbosch University closed.